Your instructor tonight is Annie Dru, certified childbirth educator. Annie attended the University of California, San Diego, and has studied the art of human nutrition, specifically as regards the reproductive cycle, for the past 25 years. She teaches a local 6-week class series on traditional food preparation techniques based on the research of Weston A. Price, DDS. Annie is probably one of the people that I know that is the most familiar with nutrition and physical degeneration in the book. She has lectured at San Diego State University, the University of California, San Diego, and most recently at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She was drawn to the work of Dr. Price when confronted with her own life-threatening illness. After years of exploring macrobiotics, vegetarianism, and other fad diets, she regained her health by following the principles of his research. With passion, she shares his ancient wisdom with others who are searching and are struggling to regain their birthright of perfect health. Today, Annie will be speaking on the 6 secrets for health according to traditional diets from around the world. You will learn about lactofermentation, which replenishes the gut with good bacteria, old-fashioned meat stock and bone broth that heals the gut, proper preparation of grains and seeds for maximum digestibility and nutrient absorption, organ meats that repair and rebuild the body, raw and rare animal foods that increase one's energies.
How many of you here have read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration? Or even perused it, looked at the photos maybe? Raise them high. Okay, good. Because you know, Dr. Price used to really adhere to the adage, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. And in that particular tome, I feel like just looking at the photographs and reading the captions will tell the whole story of Dr. Price's research. So tonight we're going to talk about how we can extrapolate from Dr. Price's massive research project elements that we can utilize every single day, 3 times a day in our own kitchen to achieve the type of immunity that the indigenous people Dr. Price studied were blessed to enjoy. How many of you here have a memory of parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who had longevity and wellness through most of their life? Oh, good, a lot of us. Okay. My great-great-grandparents, I'm from Iowa, from the heartland, and they were Czechoslovakian immigrants, and they lived well into their 90s without cancer, heart disease, diabetes, any of the other markers of metabolic syndrome that we're also familiar with today. And when they died very peacefully. They died after a full life. They felt satisfied with the work they did here, and they were ready to move on. And if only we could capture that magic element again and imbue our own lives with that same confidence that we too could live full and productive lives, and when we were ready to end this phase of our journey, we would do so peacefully and comfortably. How many of you here have loved ones that are in the throes of Alzheimer's dementia? Quite a few. Okay. It's a painful thing to watch, to be a part of, to experience with your loved ones, right? Because what's more important at the end of our life than our memories, right? That's what we really hold near and dear to our hearts in those last years, is all of the rich and varied experiences we've had in a lifetime. And our desire is to pass them down to the generations underneath us, right? And make sure that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren have the knowledge and the wisdom that we've taken an entire lifetime to accumulate. But when we get to be that age and we can't remember what we had for lunch, let alone what it was like when there were only horse and buggy and kerosene lanterns and things like that. When we can't share that information anymore, we've really lost a vast amount of our cultural wealth. So we're in a conundrum because Alzheimer's is on the rise. It's increasing, right, every single year. How many of you here are familiar with Dr. David Perlmutter and the book Grain Brain? Good. Have any of you seen his PBS special, Brain Change? Getting a lot of nodding. Yeah, really fascinating and empowering information. So that's one end of the spectrum, is what's happening to our elderly people. At the other end of the spectrum, we have devastatingly a condition known as autism. So about 1 in 50 of our children at the last count were in the throes of this debilitating disorder. I myself and my family have been profoundly affected. I have one of my 4 sons has Asperger's syndrome, and I have a niece with severe autism and a nephew with Asperger's syndrome. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's just about the most tragic thing you can watch. So then the Alzheimer's epidemic is this epidemic of children who all of a sudden are unable to make connections at a heart level with other people, who are unable to communicate their desires, their thoughts, their wants, their needs, are unable to do things that we just assume, we just take for granted that everybody is going to be able to do. And so when you think about 1 in 50 kids, what you're really talking about is 1 child on every school bus. And that's the latest count. Before that it was 1 in 88. Before that it was 1 in 150. You know, and however far back ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, 1 in 100,000. So it's really escalating very quickly, very, very quickly. And it's never, ever been more important for us to take advantage of the work Dr. Price did back in the mid-30s, where he traveled the world in search of people enjoying a very high level of immunity, not only to infectious diseases, which were of course the scourge at that time, but also to degenerative conditions. So dementia, autism, these weren't really big issues in Dr. Price's day, but he was forward-thinking enough to see that degeneration could take all sorts of different forms. And so what we're dealing with today is something that he might not have been able to conceive of specifically, but he could see the seeds were being sown. So Dr. Price spent 10 years traveling to 14 different countries. Those of you who are familiar with his work will know this. And what he went in search of really were beautiful smiles. Dr. Price was a dentist, and he was very concerned with dental health, obviously. He had had some experiences in his own life that were profound, one of which was losing a child of his to a dental infection. So this made a huge impact on Dr. Price. And what he was really concerned with was that the children that were coming to his practice were displaying a level of dental disease that he hadn't seen in their parents, he hadn't seen in their grandparents, and it was becoming more and more common for kids to come in with not only severe dental caries, but also with what we refer to as malocclusion, or just plain old crooked teeth. So kids were coming into Dr. Price's practice and they were smiling and opening their mouths, and what he was seeing was something kind of like a crooked tombstones in a graveyard, right? So there was not enough room in the jaw for the teeth to come in straight and for everything to be lined up. And what that was causing were all sorts of problems. Problems with chewing. Of course, problems with chewing lead to problems with digesting, problems with all sorts of neurological elements. All of these things were happening as a result of this misalignment of the teeth. So Dr. Price, being on the planet during the time he was on the planet, was very familiar with this new surge in exploration around the world, and it was coming back in the form of photographs from the National Geographic Society. How many of you here looked at that magazine when you were young? It was really exciting, wasn't it? It was cool. So in Dr. Price's day, it was even more so. And what he was seeing in these photographs, in fact, I think his nephew may have been a photographer, an explorer for National Geographic, so he was really well connected there. And what he was seeing in these photographs were people who were presenting with truly piano key teeth, right? Just broad, beautiful dental arches, straight, white, perfectly formed teeth. And along with those perfect teeth, the photographs were revealing beautiful bone structure, great physical form, a lot of stability, wide faces with plenty of room for all the teeth. You know, when there's plenty of room for all the teeth, what else is there plenty of room for? Yeah, the brain, right? All the organs of the brain. So Dr. Price saw these photographs and he thought to himself, what gives? How come these people look like this and my young patients are looking like this? What's going on? And Dr. Price was, Dr. Price has been called a genius, and I think in the truest sense of that word, he definitely was, because a genius isn't necessarily someone who has the answers, but someone who knows which questions to ask. And so Dr. Price asked the question, number one, are these people with these beautiful teeth, are they truly healthy and immune? And if so, what are they eating? You know, at that time in this country, we were really kind of at the very, beginning stages of the processed food revolution. So margarine had been introduced in the late 1800s, and it was really gaining a lot of momentum in terms of replacing butter. And then in 1911, the advent of Crisco. And Crisco, of course, came on the scene specifically to replace what?
Lard.
The dirty word, right? Exactly. So there was a lot of propaganda that was proliferated at that time, telling women, mothers and homemakers, if you use Crisco, this beautiful, clean, odorless cooking fat, instead of the traditional animal fats, in particular lard, your house will be cleaner, your children will be smarter, people will consider you in a higher socioeconomic bracket, right? So get rid of that dirty old, stinky old lard and use our very clean, very pristine, odorless cooking oil conglomeration, because it's not really an oil anymore, right? After they do what they do to it, it becomes this sort of transitory beast. It's not really a vegetable anymore, but it's certainly not a traditionally saturated fat either. So, sadly, this propaganda was very effective, and Crisco was adopted pretty much as a ubiquitous fat. I remember my mom, everything she ever baked in the 60s and 70s had Crisco in it. How many of you can relate to that? Yeah, remember the Crisco can? So when I would go visit my grandmother, especially my great-grandmother, they would have on the back of their stove a coffee can filled with lard, bacon drippings, anything else, any other animal fats that were cooked would go into that can, and then everything that went into the skillet, whether it was potatoes for breakfast or eggs, sometimes even just bread to make toast, everything was preceded by a big dollop of this animal fat. So when Crisco replaced lard, some really big changes began to happen to our understanding in this country of what health is. Really big changes. We started seeing the advent of degenerative disease. Before that, infectious disease was really the big deal. That was the killer. So if you got diphtheria, pertussis, if you got cholera, polio, any number of infectious diseases, that was the really scary beast in the room at that time. And after that, after the introduction of some of these processed fats, what we started to see was a move away from infectious disease being the really scary thing towards degenerative conditions. In particular, which two? Anybody have an idea which two diseases? They're still the number 1 and 2 diseases that are killing people in this country. Heart disease and cancer, exactly. So it's very hard for a lot of people to comprehend this, but the very first case of myocardial infarction, or death by heart attack as we know it, was in 1921. Now just let that settle in for a minute. 1921. That wasn't very long ago, right? Wasn't very long ago at all. So if you consider that Crisco was introduced in 1911, and the first case of a bona fide heart attack, now I'm not saying people didn't die from heart disease before, but it was a different kind of heart disease, congestive heart failure, rheumatic fever conditions that would cause heart problems, congenital conditions that would predispose somebody to having heart problems later in life. But this idea of like, you're on the tennis court, everything's going great, you're in your 40s, you're a young executive, and then you just drop dead. That whole concept, that didn't begin until 1921. So it doesn't take a genius to see that it wasn't very long at all before the advent of these industrially produced, what we call fake fats or pseudo fats, that we started to see a huge increase in conditions that before that time were virtually unknown. Now cancer's been around for a long time, but it was relatively rare. Today, how many of you here don't know somebody close to you that's had cancer or is dealing with cancer right now? Anybody? No one. No one. That's how common today it is, that you really, there's nobody on the planet that doesn't know somebody who has had cancer or who has cancer right now. So that's a big change from a little old cooking fat. So Dr. Price asked that second question, okay, if there are these people who are immune from both infectious and degenerative conditions, and they're sporting these beautiful smiles, what are they eating? Well, the only way to find out, of course, was to go and visit, right? So he decided that he and his wife Florence, who happened to be a nurse, would take their life savings. Now, this was an important element of the research because Dr. Price was very well respected in the dental community, in the medical community at that time. In fact, he held a position in the organization, a very high position that later came to be known as the American Dental Association. I think there is actually even, am I correct, Lindsay, there's a poster here at PPNF with signatures, I believe so, of all the different dentists from the American Dental Association that were honoring Dr. Price.
Yes.
So he wasn't an outlier. Definitely not. He was very well reputed. And so when he decided to do this research, he had many offers of financial support from various institutions. All right, but he was a clever man. And even then, there was the recognition that if you take money from an entity, you're also going to be signing on to be a representative of their agenda, right? Like today, we know that the research is being funded by various institutions that have a stake in the outcome of that research. So Dr. Price and his wife, after talking it over, decided they would not take any grant money, and in fact they would use their life savings to do this research. So that's what they did. So they started off on their journey in a very remote, tiny little village in the Swiss Alps. Extremely hard to access, okay, because it was surrounded by on three sides by a mountain range. The only access into this little village was a very narrow footpath. In fact, it was so narrow that it wouldn't even allow a cart. Okay, it wasn't even wide enough to accommodate a cart. So the only way you could take anything in or out of that village was by backpack. That meant that everything that grew there, or everything, that was consumed there, had to be grown there and raised there, except for salt, which they did actually backpack in. But other than that, they had been living for hundreds and hundreds of years in a sustainable relationship with this valley. And do you suppose they had a lot of variety in their diet? Like today? What do we hear today? What's the most important thing?
Right.
Yeah, and lots of
Colors.
which come from fruits and vegetables, right? Lots of fruits and vegetables. If you don't get your multiple servings of fruits and vegetables every day, you're predisposing yourself to these degenerative conditions like heart disease and cancer, right? Everybody knows that. You have to have a plate full of lots and lots of produce, all right? But guess what? In this little village, in this valley, in the Swiss Alps, they could barely grow anything green or yellow or red or orange or purple. Why? Because of the climate there, because of the altitude and the very short growing season. So yes, they had some produce, minimal amount, and only that which would grow during that very short season. So the predominance of their diet was not fruits and vegetables. Predominance of their diet was, fermented foods? Absolutely, because what's going to happen when you have a short growing season and all of your cabbages and all of your carrots and all of your beets and your rutabagas and parsnips and turnips, they all mature and come to fruition at the same time. Are you just going to have a big feast? And everybody just eats them all for like a week or two and then that's the end of it? Of course not. You have to employ some other methods of making sure that that harvest is secured for the rest of the year until the next harvest. So that's definitely one of the principles that we're going to discuss on our journey this evening. But the foundation of their diet was not these produce items. The foundation of their diet, oddly enough, were the two foods that are the most eschewed today because of intolerances, sensitivities and allergies that people have developed. Does anybody have I want to take a stab at what those two food groups are? Dairy, for sure, right? And in particular, what kind of dairy is problematic in our culture? Cow dairy, and in what form? Milk. Liquid milk, absolutely.
Pasteurized.
Who said that? And so the problem is, are you saying the problem is
Changing milk by pasteurizing.
changing milk by pasteurizing? Absolutely. So one of the foods that's most demonized in our culture is dairy, full fat dairy in particular, fluid milk, and God forbid it should be raw, right? Well, guess what? That was the mainstay of the diet of these Swiss villagers that Dr. Price studied first on his journey and found to have almost 0% tooth decay. To have beautiful wide dental arches with all their teeth lined up in a row. To have very well formed physiques. To be very strong, very beautiful people who were in possession of an absolutely phenomenal degree of immunity from infectious disease. Infectious disease at that time was really feared most in the form of, does anybody know what disease at that time in the 30s was really scary the world over?
Polio?
A little bit later, but what is tuberculosis? TB. TB was the scourge during that time. So to find a group of people in Europe that were, for all intents and purposes, completely immune to this very terrifying disease was unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. And yet, in the entire history of that village, there had never been a case of tuberculosis. And what were they blaming tuberculosis on at that time? Raw milk. Raw milk. And yet that's what these people were nourishing themselves with every single day, was raw milk. In the form of cheese and butter and so forth, right? Again, because what happens to raw milk if it's left at room temperature for any length of time? It sours. What happens to pasteurized milk if it's left at room temperature? Exactly. Yeah, it rots. So the Swiss were employing one of our principles, the one here on the bottom right-hand corner, the principle of lactofermentation. Now I call it pickles because that's what most people are familiar with when it comes to food that's been alchemized and changed form and gone from something sweet to something sour. But in the case of our ancestors, pickling was achieved not by adding an acid, like in the form of vinegar, like we do today, or pasteurizing that medium, but by employing the microbes that live on the surface of every living thing. Okay, the lactobacteria. And that includes milk. So if you leave milk at room temperature for a couple of hours, it begins the process of clabbering. It goes from being a sweet food to being a sour food. That's preserved, that's held in suspended animation so that it can be consumed at a later date. So this was the number one mainstay of these wise ancestors in Switzerland, was the raw dairy products that had been cultured. Right? What was the other things? Anybody want to take a guess? How about you, Duff?
Well, the fermented foods, like you mentioned, and
What did they have their cheese on?
oh, the bread.
Yes.
Sourdough.
So what's the other thing in our culture that people are showing intolerances to in ever-growing numbers? Gluten. Gluten from wheat and rye, right? Okay, so the Swiss diet consisted on a daily basis, day in and day out, for hundreds and hundreds of years, of a piece of sourdough rye bread slathered in raw cultured butter with a big hunk of cheese. Sounds delicious, doesn't it?
Is that bread toasted?
Yeah, I'm guessing so. Probably some animal fat in a skillet. So let's just extrapolate for a moment. If these people had a diet that was built on the foundation of gluten-containing grains and lactose and casein-containing dairy products, do you suppose there were very many intolerant children? Gluten-intolerant children, lactose-intolerant children in that village? What would happen to a child in that village who was lactose or gluten intolerant?
Starved.
They would starve. They would starve because that's what they ate every day. Isn't that fascinating? Try to go into a elementary school cafeteria today and find any number of children who don't have some sort of intolerance, some sort of food intolerance. Yeah, it's almost impossible today, right? Everybody's intolerant to these foods, and they're demonized as if somehow, fundamentally, there's something wrong with the food. Foods that have been nourishing humankind for anywhere from 10 to 20,000 years. All of a sudden, they're just not fit to be digested. Does that make any sense at all? No, of course not. So there's secrets, right? All of a sudden we're seeing, wow, they knew something we don't know. And we're going to delve into what it is that they knew, that we can now reintroduce ourselves to and employ and utilize to bring us back to that same level of immunity. Okay, so Dr. Price left Switzerland, and he then traveled to the Outer Hebrides Islands off the coast of Scotland. Now, these also extremely remote locales. These are places that are almost impossible most of the year to access, because these islands are sitting in the middle of an ocean that is very capricious and unpredictable and likes to just throw up a big storm and swamp a boat and take everyone to the bottom of the sea on a regular basis. So getting to these Outer Hebrides Islands was extremely difficult to do. There was only a small window of time when it could be done. Now, why do you suppose it was important that Dr. Price go to places that were very, very remote in his quest for... They were eating their indigenous food. And what is their indigenous food? Well, we're just going to, for the sake of argument, we're just going to say their indigenous food is that which had been nourishing their cultural heritage for millennia. That's what I mean by that. For a long, long time. And if they were still eating their own indigenous diet, what were they not eating?
Processed modern diet.
The modern diet. So Dr. Price had a term for what we refer to as the modern diet. He called it the food displacing foods of modern commerce. These are the foods that take the place of the foods that our ancestors relied on day in and day out, all through the seasons, all through their lifetimes, all through the generations, the thousands and thousands of years, okay?
What year did his exploration?
Mid-30s. So in the mid-30s, people in the United States were still consuming mostly farm foods, right? The processed foods were just beginning to make their appearance. However, the fascinating thing is that when Dr. Price would go to these remote areas and he would examine everybody, because that's what he'd do. He'd go into a village, he'd get permission from the elders to do his research, and then he would line everybody up, tallest to smallest, and he would do what dentists do. What do? They open up mouths and they count cavities, right? And he had Florence, his wife, standing by, taking copious notes, making sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted in the research. And when he would do that, every single time, and you can kind of imagine what this is like, but every time he would open a mouth, he'd be like, what? He couldn't believe it. Why? Because he had to open 3 mouths to see any incidents of dental caries. Any small little incidents, right? That's unheard of. So Dr. Price said that when he went to the Swiss village, the really interesting thing was he had to, when he opened the kids' mouths, he had to take his tools and scrape off what he referred to as a thick green slime. These people had no toothbrushes, they had no dental floss, no water pick, no fluoride treatments, no dentists, right? And so they had no dental hygiene, and yet, even so, they had such a low incidence of dental caries. So when he would scrape off that green slime, he'd get in there, and there really wasn't much to count. These kids had an immunity from dental caries. Now, how can that be without all the accoutrements of modern dental hygiene? Right? Isn't that that's absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary to make sure you don't get cavities. Isn't that interesting? So right away he's thinking, wow, okay, you don't have toothbrushes, and yet they don't have cavities. What's going on? They're consuming raw dairy products, they don't have tuberculosis. The next place he visited, as I said, were the Outer Hebrides Islands. Now there, they had a completely different diet. In Switzerland, it was the sourdough rye bread, the cultured butter and cheese, and then whatever produce they could secure from their harvest of the season and then, consume until it ran out the next season. That was pretty much their diet. Now, once a week, they would slaughter an animal so that they could get rennet for the cheese that they were making. And so they would make a big, stew or pot of soup, and they would have broth, and everybody would consume that until it was gone. So they had meat about once a week. The rest of the time, it was the bread and cheese and whatever produce they could pull together. That was it. Not a lot of variety in that diet. Well, guess what? The islanders of the Outer Hebrides had an even more restricted diet. Okay, even more restricted, because those islands. I don't know how many of you have ever seen photos of the Outer Hebrides.
I've seen them.
It's like, you've seen it.
Yeah.
So it's like a moonscape, right? It's just unbelievable. Like trees, it's just rocks, it's craggy, and it's like really very intimidating. And it would look like it couldn't support life at all. And yet, these islanders were able to carve out a livelihood for themselves, predominantly from the sea. So they were fishermen. Now, in terms of grain foods to complement their seafood, the only thing that would grow on the islands were, does anybody know? Guess? In Scotland? Oats. Oats, yeah, absolutely, oats. So they had oats, and they had seafood, and they had very little else. In fact, Dr. Price was really surprised when he met a young girl on one of the islands. He showed her an apple, and she'd never seen one before. In her whole life, had never seen an apple. That's how remote these people were. So, did the same thing, lined everybody up, opened up the mouths, counted the cavities, lo and behold, same story. For all intents and purposes, almost no cavities. Almost no cavities. Now, at the same time, he's noticing the lack of dental caries. He's also observing these beautiful, stalwart, constitutionally strong people that had immunity to infectious and degenerative disease. An unbelievably high level of immunity on nothing but oats and seafood. No variety. No, whatever they say, 6 to 11 servings of produce every day, filling up their plate. How did they do it? Well, oddly enough, when Dr. Price would take note of everybody's physical and dental condition, he at the same time would take samples of their food, samples of their soil, and he would take it back to his laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio, where he was from, and he would analyze it for nutrient content. And what he found is the samples from the foods, the indigenous foods of the people he visited in these remote locales, was anywhere from 4 to 5 times more water-soluble vitamins and minerals, 4 to 5 times more on average, of vitamin B complex, vitamin C, and then all the minerals, and 10 times more dense in the fat-soluble vitamins. And that would be vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K2, vitamin E. The fat-soluble vitamins, unlike the water-soluble vitamins, are predominantly found in what category of food? Animal. Animal. Okay? So you'll hear a lot about, especially in the vegetarian community, you'll hear a lot about, I get all the vitamin A I need, I eat lots of carrots. Does anybody know, is there any vitamin A in a carrot? No. None. Isn't that astounding? We've got the precursors to vitamin A that have to go through all sorts of alchemy to actually become vitamin A, which is very difficult to do. And in fact, they are not vitamin A. So they can't do the things in the body that vitamin A does. One of the things in the body that vitamin A does is it ensures a high level of immunity. It's an immune enhancer. So just imagine, now he's comparing these food sources from the indigenous groups to those foods which were widely available in Cleveland, Ohio at that time. Again, like I said, many of which were still coming from a farm, like a real farm, not an industrial farm, but a real family farm. And even so, the foods that the indigenous people were consuming were 4 to 5 times higher in those water-soluble vitamins and minerals, and 10 times higher in the fat-soluble nutrients. So this is very interesting. The plot thickens. From the Outer Hebrides Islands, he went to Alaska. Now in Alaska, they weren't eating rye bread and cultured dairy products. They weren't eating oats and seafood. And in particular, I should just note that the seafood that the islanders were consuming was predominantly cod, and in the form of cod liver. Okay, they really emphasized the organs inside the fish, and in particular the liver. So I told you about the little Swiss children's daily luncheon being the bread, the butter, the cheese. The Outer Hebrides Islanders would consume a stuffed cod's head, stuffed with oats, with chopped cod's liver, every morning as their breakfast. You think you get your kids to eat that? So that was their kind of go-to meal. You had the bread, the butter, the cheese, you had the cod's head with the oats, with the liver stuffed in there and baked. Yum. This makes me hungry. Get to Alaska, and of course they have a completely different dietary agenda there. And again, they're seafaring people, so lots and lots of fish. In Alaska, what Dr. Price found is they didn't cook their fish, unlike the Outer Hebrides Islanders. When they would come back, Dr. Price said they'd dig it up and pull it out, and it would be what he referred to as sub-rancid. And it was very gooey. Kind of like you might imagine a brie or a camembert. It was stinky. He said, in fact, it was so odoriferous that he couldn't really go anywhere near it. But he'd keep it at arm's length. And the Alaskans absolutely relished this dish, this very stinky, stringy, gooey fish. And it was a mainstay of their diet. Another thing the Alaskans did is they placed a really high emphasis, especially for their pre-reproductive young ladies, on fish eggs, or roe, or caviar as well. And in fact, they would dry it, and they would put it in little pouches, and the girls would wear the pouches, and they'd carry it around. So kind of like our kids do gummy bears, they were doing fish eggs. The Alaskans also had an interesting cuisine habit of dipping every morsel of food that they consumed in seal oil. Every bite of food first went into the dish of seal oil. You can see they were following a low-fat protocol. And when they did eat plant food, it was usually in the form of the stomach contents of the caribou that they would slaughter. So it was pre-digested grass was what they were eating as their 6 to 11 servings of produce. So again, we see a very high emphasis on what category of food? Animal food. What is more vilified these days, and especially pinned with responsibility for causing those two most frightening degenerative diseases that are killing people left and right, than animal food? Especially fatty animal food, yes? Right, so we want lean meat, we want the boneless, skinless breasts, we want to trim all the fat off of our juicy steak, because that's going to protect us from heart disease and cancer. Guess what was absent in the Alaskan culture? Absent. Didn't exist. And they had beautiful teeth. And they had beautiful bone structure. And they had happy babies. Dr. Price said he never heard an Eskimo baby cry the entire time he was there. Completely content. No children with ADHD. No grandparents with dementia. Healthy people. Healthy people consuming an animal fat-rich diet. As I mentioned, the final principle on our chart here is the principle of lactofermented foods and cultured foods. But what about people who lived in tropical locales like the Polynesians? Well, Dr. Price visited them too. Once again, seafaring people, lots of seafood. Their special food, unlike the fish eggs of the Eskimos, their special food was the liver of a very particular shark. And this was something that was not easy to obtain. Now, a lot of these foods took some either effort or some time or some thought to secure for the group. And so Dr. Price would ask the leaders of these various tribes, why do you go to so much trouble to dry your fish eggs, or to culture your cream, or to secure these very difficult to retrieve fish to get the livers. Why do you do this? And 201, Dr. Price said that they relayed that the reason they did it was so that they could have perfect babies, healthy babies. That was their reason. In fact, that was their reason to be. Why would that be? Why is that so important to have healthy babies? Don't they have neonatal intensive care units? Right? Don't they have all sorts of developmental specialists? Don't they have ophthalmologists and orthodontics and behavior modification? No? They didn't have those things? They didn't have those things. They had absolutely no infrastructure to deal with babies and children and young adults and adults and elderly people who weren't healthy. What would happen to a group, okay, that was living right at that very tenuous place between survival and non-survival if any number of members of their group were not healthy? What would happen? They'd die. Extinction. Exactly. So when they said, we do what we do so we can have healthy babies, what they were really saying is, because we're doing this because we want our culture to survive. Because they needed every pair of hands, every pair of legs, every pair of eyes, every heart, every mind actively engaged in the business of survival, cooperation. Could they afford to have sullen and obstinate and contrary adolescents in their group? Not for long. Not for long. And guess what? They didn't. One of my very favorite pictures that Dr. Price took, and he took thousands and thousands of photographs, is a picture of a young man, and I wish I had it in front of me. I know it's here at the foundation. Picture of a young man from one of the Polynesian islands, and he's standing by the sea, probably about 15 or 16 years old, and he's looking kind of shyly at the camera, and he has the most radiant, contented, peaceful, cooperative, joyful smile I've ever seen on a teenager. And I raised 4 boys. They didn't look like that. I'm sad to say that they did not look like that at any stage of their adolescence. Okay. So when I saw this photograph of this young adolescent boy, I can't even begin to tell you the feelings that I had. It was all at once, just all kinds of feelings: regret, remorse, sadness, confusion, optimism. I felt it all at one time because I thought, if it was possible then and there, it's possible here and now. What that young man was radiating, what those Swiss villagers were radiating, and the islanders and the Outer Hebrides and the Alaskans, was our birthright. Okay? Our birthright of perfect physical, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being. We were all born with the intention of manifesting these gifts. To what end? Why? That's kind of an existential question, but why? So that we can be in the best possible position and frame of mind and state of heart to bring forward that which we came to this planet to do, right? Our purpose, our destiny. The only way we can do that is if we feel great. How many of you here resonate with that statement? It's really hard to be your best and to give your best if you don't feel well. That's what brought me here. I was a musician. Any night of the week like this, I'd be out doing a gig. And then I got sick. I got really sick. And the sicker I got, the more frightened I became, as is true for most of us. We don't pay a lot of attention to our health when we're okay, when we're just kind of making it. As soon as the rug gets pulled out from under you, and all of a sudden, like me, it's hard to stand up for 5 minutes, let alone hours, like I can do now, thanks be to God. When it's a chore to get up and down out of a chair, right? All of a sudden, like, wait a minute, it's not supposed to be like this. I'm young, I'm healthy, what's going on? And for many of us, that's the only thing that will get us to thinking about what we're nourishing ourselves with, or if we're even nourishing ourselves. For many people, that's the very first wake-up call, is pain, debility, loss of, bless you, loss of an ability to do what it is we're here to do. I thought I was here to do music, who knew? I'm here to talk to you guys about pickles. I didn't know. And I wouldn't be here tonight if it wasn't for the fact that I was desperate, I was terrified, and I knew that something in my life had to change. And I, like Dr. Price, had an idea that it probably had something to do with what I was eating. Even though I was a whole food shopper, you know, that was really kind of, that was my, what's the right word? I placated myself with that idea. Oh, I buy organic. I hear a lot of people tell me, a lot of my students, but I buy organic. I'm really healthy. I eat really good because I go to the health food store and I buy organic. So how is it I was shopping at the organic food store and I was still so ill? How is that possible? Right? Isn't that all you need to do? That's what they tell us. I was eating my 6 to 11 servings of fruits and vegetables every day. In fact, I had been predominantly a vegan for about 3.5 years. Now, how much healthier can you get than to just have a completely plant-based diet? They tell us that's pinnacle, right? If you can do that, if you can deprive yourself of animal foods, you're going to live forever, just like those Okinawans, who, by the way, their word for meat in Okinawa is pig. That's why they live so long. So, if you're anything like me, you're probably here because something hurts, or something doesn't feel quite right. Or maybe you wake up in the morning and you go, ugh, another day. Now see, that's not what I saw in that photograph of that young man. I didn't see him with an attitude of like, oh, here I am another day. And yet, just go out on the street. Look at young people, anywhere between like 13 and 18. Look at me. They're not doing that because they're perverse. They have that affect because they're in pain. And they're angry about it because they know they deserve better. They know that they were born to be well and to feel great and to meet every day, every challenge, every moment with a smile. Because everything's okay. Why is everything okay? Because I'm okay. Fundamentally, I feel well. If we feel well, there's no challenge too great. Yes, the world's going to hell. So what? We can fix it. We just have to feel good to do it. If we don't feel good, nothing else works. Life comes to a screeching halt in my own personal experience. So I came to this out of necessity. I'm guessing most of you, or those of you who are here for loved ones, are here out of necessity. The good news is if the people that Dr. Price studied were able to greet each and every new day with joy and wellness, we can too. We can too. How do we do it? Well, that's what his journey was all about, right? Taking notes, making observations, putting 2 and 2 together. After I finished reading Nutrition and Physical Degeneration and looking at all the pictures and just blowing my mind day after day, I would burn the midnight oil for this book. Just like, have that light, and I was like, turn off the light! I can't! He's going to a new country! I can't stop. So excited. I did that because I wanted to look like the healthy people in that book, in those photographs. And in fact, what I really looked like, and what my children predominantly looked like, were the unhealthy examples in that book. I don't feel good. Leave me alone. I can't help you. I can't help myself. And I knew that if I was resembling those people, it's probably because I had grown up eating and was still eating in a way that mirrored the way those people had eaten. So what's the difference? What about the people that Dr. Price studied that were not enjoying this high level of immunity, that were not radiating joy and wellness? What were they eating? You said it earlier. What were they eating? The displacing foods of modern commerce. These are the foods that made their way from the Western world to the far reaches of the planet as we started moving out of our own realm and into the realm of the indigenous to take over their land, to get more resources, more space, more labor. And when we came to do that, we brought our food with us. How many of you here have heard of the company store? Right? What's the company store all about?
Workers, it was the only place some workers could buy anything, and it was like fake.
Barter,
Yeah.
right? So you trade your labor for our food. So if the Western world went out to the far reaches and they were going to build some infrastructure, they were going to build a railroad or something like that, what do they need? Well, they needed a labor force. Where did they get that labor force? From those indigenous communities. Okay, so paying them with money, they didn't need money. What do they need? Food, sustenance. Well, the indigenous people, particularly the younger indigenous people, had their head turned by that idea. Ooh, Westerners, white people, civilized. It's very exciting. You know how young people are. They want what's new. They want what's cool. The indigenous young people were no different, so they got sucked in. And when they would leave their indigenous community, their traditional diet behind, and they would join forces with the Western world and consume, as a form of payment for their labor, these displacing foods of modern commerce, the devastation was unbelievable. All you have to do is open the book and look at it. You will see things that you wouldn't even imagine could happen. Open fissures and fistulas. Okay, because people had such bad infection. Remember, the foods of modern commerce got to these outlying areas long before the dentist came with their palliative measures, right? So if you had dental decay that went into the root and the nerve and caused an infection and eventually caused you to have open weeping wounds on your face, guess what? You're out of luck. Because there's no medicine, there's no dentist, there's no nothing. Dr. Price said the Eskimos had a very high incidence, those of them that had adopted these Western foods, a very high incidence of suicide. Because the pain would become so unbearable that that was their only way out. Now, if a person had been raised on their indigenous diet and then they had adopted later in life these modern foods, it was one story. It's usually a story of someone with a beautiful wide dental arch, nice physique, well-formed body. The thing about a well-formed body is that it's the infrastructure, it's the foundation for everything else, right, inside. So if we have great bone structure, we're wide, broad, we have good facial structure, what that usually tells us is that everything else is equally well put together. It's like when you build a house and you have to put up the frame, the foundation and the frame. If you do the frame right, then the electrical wiring will go in okay, and the plumbing, and and the shingles will go on the roof nicely. Everything will line up and be very stable, and it will be very ergonomic. It'll be very beautiful, and it will be very long-lasting. It all starts with that really well put together frame. Well, it's no different with the human body. Put the frame together right, then we're going to enjoy a very high level of all of these elements. And if we don't, that's a whole different story. So if these people had grown up on their indigenous diet, then they were put together well, and all their wiring and plumbing was working well, then they would adopt these foods and they would experience relatively mild dental caries. They'd start to get cavities, which is no fun. And they might all of a sudden lose their level of immunity to infection. That can be tragic at times. But if these went back to their indigenous community, they were very quickly bounced back, very quickly regain their dental integrity, very quickly regain their immunity, and all was well. Dr. Price saw many cases of that. If, on the other hand, these people, while they were in the throes of these foods of modern commerce, decided to reproduce and have children, very different story, entirely different story. These children were not born with a sound foundation and frame. These children were born already exhibiting signs of degeneration. And you can see it in the photographs. Now all of a sudden they're way more susceptible to dental caries, way more susceptible to infectious disease. And moreover, their jaws are so narrowed and pulled in that there wasn't room for all their teeth, and malocclusion was the result. And it's very disturbing to see the photographic evidence of this in one generation. Just one generation can create profound degeneration when the dietary needs are not met. Okay, so was anybody able to come up with a question or a comment or thought, an idea? Yes, ma'am. Okay, let's get you the microphone. Everybody can hear. Okay.
I have a few. I was wondering what, if you could name some local sources for finding the good products like bones, raw dairy, grease, fermentation, grass, organ meat. Are they available?
Absolutely. They're definitely available, and although I won't probably give specifics right now in this venue, what I will do is talk about principles of sourcing. So we'll definitely get to that. That's a great one. Thank you.
And then I'm sure you're familiar with the China study.
Yes.
Is there any common ground between Dr. Price and the China study?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Not so much. Remember, the China study, the book, is actually not a study. It's a book about a research project by T. Colin Campbell. It's not a study. So it's a little bit confusing to people sometimes because they think it is, in fact, a research project itself, but it's not. And there's actually a woman named Denise Minger, who's a statistician, who has pretty much debunked all the conclusions that Mr. Campbell came to in that book. And she has a website called Raw Food SOS. And if you're interested in learning more about the China study and the statistics that are relayed in that book, then that might be a good place to start.
Okay. I don't want to hug the microphone.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, come on. There we go.
I'm interested in what you were discussing in terms of fermented grain or the rye sourdough. Is that something you're going to be discussing?
Absolutely.
Specifically? Okay.
Thank you. Now that I know that you're interested,
Yeah,
we'll
definitely.
go into
Thank
more
you.
detail about that.
Okay.
But I'm interested in like first foods for baby because I have my first grandson.
Wonderful question. I love that. Okay, we're going to definitely talk about that because Dr. Price's research uncovered some very interesting things about infant feeding. So we'll go there. Were you raising your hand? You're just yawning.
Sorry.
Okay. So that's 3. Anybody else? Okay.
I was wondering what your thought was on freezing food. Does it have nutritional value?
Well, the Eskimos did apparently not think so.
And did the Swiss freeze some of their?
Not that Dr. Price relayed, but that doesn't mean that they did not.
Okay, and then do you have recommendations on amounts per week or day that you should have the things that you're talking about?
Great question. Okay, all right. I think I have a pretty good idea where people want to go with this. Oh, please.
Bone health.
Bone health, a very timely issue. Yeah. I mean, it's really funny, but Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, who wrote the GAPS book, how many of you are familiar with Dr.? Okay, good. So Dr. McBride says that in her practice, she's finding children presenting with osteoporosis today. Children. Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. And if you have not yet made yourself familiar with that book, I highly recommend you do. It's here at the foundation. It's available, as is Dr. McBride's book, Put Your Heart in Your Mouth. And Dr. McBride is a neurologist who specializes in treating autism. And she treats autism, oddly enough, with animal fat. Animal fat, that's sort of the cornerstone. Bone broth, meat stock, and animal fat. So she had so many of her patients coming to her saying, but wait, I might get rid of my, mother's dementia or my child's autism, but won't they end up with a heart attack from all that animal fat? So she got herself fatigued of telling everybody the same story, so she wrote a book called Put Your Heart in Your Mouth. And it's all about how animal fat is not at the root of heart disease. It's just not.
I think in addition to everything, all the comments relative to nutrition, diet, the ideal foods, et cetera, we also, as a life coach, I wanted to take a look at my whole life, my attitudes, my relationships, my career, my family, et cetera, and design my destiny in each of those areas.
Beautiful.
And let's start with the nutrition of the body and also of the mind and the brain.
So you're looking at it very holistically. How does this fit in with all the other elements? And the beauty of it is, in my experience, is that it's all interwoven, right?
Yes.
So if you start with the foundation of good health, you're going to be in a better position mentally, emotionally, spiritually,
Exactly.
to address the more specific areas of your life, your work, your relationships, and so forth. If you don't feel well, it's really hard to put your attention on anything except the fact that you don't feel well. It becomes all consuming. We become very self-absorbed, right? It's hard to see past our own pain. And to really have that deep empathy for humanity that we would ordinarily have. And that wanting to connect, that feeling, is diminished when we're unwell. What we really want to do is just sort of like hunker down, pull in, hide from the world until we feel better. So feeling well is kind of at the very root of being able to self-actualize in all the other areas of our life. So I definitely appreciate what you said. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about the Crisco replacing the animal fat. Well, isn't sugar also somehow a key as far as our degenerative diseases, not just the minus the animal fat? So will that be?
Yes. So what you're describing is the replacing of the traditional animal fats and tropical oils of our ancestors with these new fake fats, industrial fats that are really plant-based, hydrogenated products, along with the incredible increase in sugar in our diet, starting in Dr. Price's day and really reaching its apex now. Do those two things create a perfect storm? Absolutely. And there's a doctor named Dr. Catherine Shanahan who wrote another book that's available here called Deep Nutrition, Why Our Genes Need Traditional Food. And her one of her main premises of the book is that these two food or faux food categories, the fake fats and the sugar-laden foods, are actually coming together to create the nightmare that we're experiencing today. Now, Dr. Price called these foods the displacing foods. The vegetable oils and the hydrogenated fats, along with the white flours, which are all sugar, right? White sugar, white flour, it's all sugar. Dr. Price called these the displacing foods because when you take in your calories in the form of these compromised foods, what you're really doing, in addition to placing a toxic burden on your system, you're also squeezing out the room where the very nutrient-dense foods would take precedence, right? That's really the biggest part of the problem. The body can detoxify. We were created with a very elaborate and very elegant detoxification system. So it's not the detoxifying that's the biggest part of that problem. The biggest part of that problem is the deficiency part. And that happens when these compromised foods take up space in our diet. Space that used to be filled with things like liver. Remember? In our grandmother's day, the adage was liver once a week. So maybe this is a great place to jump off and talk about our 6 principles. All right, we've already touched on number 1, which is the principle of animal fat, vital cholesterol-rich animal fat, and the tropical oils like coconut oil, palm kernel oil, that are very high in saturates. These are the fats that nourished our ancestors for millennia. Not Crisco. Not Parquet. Now, I grew up in a household where butter never crossed the threshold. My mom had a cabinet in the 70s that was full of little plastic yellow tubs. We used to, build stuff with them when I was a kid and use them for all sorts of art projects and stuff because they just kept piling up until they'd fill the cabinet, and then they'd take them all out, and then they'd fill up the cabinet again. All right, so these are the foods that displace these vital animal fats. Not only are they toxic in their own right, but they squeeze out the space that would have been occupied by things like lard, tallow, butter, ghee, schmaltz. Does everybody know what schmaltz is? They call it the Jewish lard, right? It's poultry fat. Lard comes from pigs. Tallow is the fat that's rendered from ruminant animals, animals that eat grass. So that could be anything from a cow to a sheep to a camel to a water buffalo, horse. Anything that eats grass is a ruminant animal. And those animals, when you render their fat, they deliver you something called tallow. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. The French traditionally fried their pommes frites or their French fries in a combination of horse and beef tallow. Until, in fact, 1984, McDonald's, right here in this good old land of America, fried their French fries in tallow. Which is why when I was a girl, you would go to McDonald's and you would get a little packet of fries. They stood up like little soldiers at attention. You remember that? And you bit into them, and they were crispy on the outside, and they were soft on the inside. And then in 1984, the industrial fat lobby made McDonald's change their mind and replace all the tallow in their fryers with vegetable oil. Now all of a sudden their French fries are limp. They don't stand up, they're not crispy, they taste funny, no good anymore. Until she died, Julia Child kept lobbying McDonald's to please bring the tallow back for the French fries. Our ancestors who cooked with lard and tallow and schmaltz, and those ancestors on the other side of the equator, they used coconut oil liberally. Coconut oil is higher in saturated fat than any of the animal fats. It's 95% saturated. Coconut oil, which is why they took it out of all the baked goods. The bakery industry in this country until the 50s and 60s relied on coconut oil and palm kernel oil to make all of the confections light and fluffy and delicious. Do you remember that? Does anybody? I remember candy bars. Coconut oil, palm kernel oil. Do you remember that? Back in the day? Yeah. Wonderful stuff. Magical stuff. The principle of grease refers to the way our ancestors prized foods high in these saturated fats, rich in cholesterol, in particular the animal fats. They prized them. They revered them. Even in this country, we used to say the fat of the land. Remember? Because fat is analogous to health. And health is analogous to wealth. Okay? Because you have nothing if you don't have your health. We can all agree. You have nothing. Doesn't matter if you have a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe and you drive a big, beautiful Escalade. Doesn't matter. How many times a year you go to Hawaii or Paris? Just doesn't matter. So, fat is absolutely essential in our wellness protocol because it's the conveyance for the nutrients that Dr. Price found to be 10 times more abundant in our ancestors' diet. What are those substances? Who remembers?
Vitamins.
Fat-soluble vitamins. If you don't emphasize foods high in fat, how are you going to get the fat-soluble vitamins? If you trim all the fat off your steak and you pull the skin off your chicken, where are you going to get them? In a pill? And a carrot? I don't think so. No. So our ancestors knew how important these nutrients were. The reason they were important, remember we talked about the frame, the foundation and the frame. Any structure, including the human body, the integrity of that frame is at the heart of the integrity of the whole organism, or the whole structure. That frame in a human organism is made out of, what did you ask me about earlier?
Bones.
Right? Bone. Correct. Okay. So bone cannot be made in the absence of these fat-soluble vitamins. Why? Because bone is made of minerals, right? Calcium, phosphorus, so forth. Okay, so bone is made of minerals. Minerals cannot be laid down in the bony structure without vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K2. That's why Dr. Price dubbed these nutrients the activators, because they activate the deposition of minerals in the bony structures like these. You have calcium in your teeth because you have fat in your diet. You have immunity from osteoporosis because you have fat in your diet. If you don't have fat in your diet, you will have bones like Swiss cheese and your teeth will fall out of your head. That frame will be compromised. This is really a tough one for us to comprehend. How essential these nutrients are in creating a sound structure for our body. So when we go on a low-fat protocol like we've done, all of us have been very diligent, have our lean cuisine, take all the fat out everywhere we can. What we're doing is we're robbing our bony structures. Because in the absence of these nutrients, minerals will be excreted from the body. Dr. Price said it is quite possible to be mineral deficient even when minerals are abundant in the diet. Vegan, anyone? You know what my vegan students are? But I get lots of minerals. I eat kale. I eat root vegetables, right? I eat nuts. I eat all these high mineral foods. I should be fine. What's happening to all their minerals? Well, they're leaving their body in the form of very expensive waste products. All that organic kale, all those beautiful green smoothies right down the drain. Because without the fat-soluble vitamins, they're excreted. Worse yet, if they're not excreted, they can be diverted away from the bony structure in the absence, in particular, of a nutrient called vitamin K2, which Dr. Price called activator X, because in those days, it wasn't known to be vitamin K2. In the absence of that nutrient, minerals that are held in the body can be diverted away from the bony structures and laid down in the soft tissue. What you have then is calcification. And what you have next is inflammation. What you have next is degeneration. So, these fat-soluble vitamins are at the crux. That's why I put this number one, grease. Number one principle of indigenous diets, of ancestral cuisine, is emphasizing these nutrient-dense animal fats and tropical oils. And tropical oils are not where you're going to find the fat-soluble vitamins. It's not where you're going to find cholesterol, but it's where you're going to find the saturated fatty acids that are integral to every cell of our body. Most notably, this organ right here. How many of you have heard about coconut oil and Alzheimer's? Awesome, cool. Because coconut oil is 95% saturated. Beef tallow is 65. Lard, about 45. Coconut oil is the most saturated food on the planet. The brain is made up of saturated fatty acids and cholesterol. If you cut this food group out of your diet, what are you doing to your brain? It will shrink. They do. In the absence of these very important nutrients, the brain will shrink. Cholesterol is your very best friend. Those of you who have paid attention to Dr. Perlmutter already know this. Cholesterol is what will keep you from succumbing to this absolutely devastating epidemic of Alzheimer's disease. Lots and lots of cholesterol. Our ancestors knew this. They had the can of lard on the back of the stove, remember? Our Scottish ancestors, they would fish for salmon. Salmon's higher in cholesterol than beef or lamb. Beautiful thing. We don't want to be afraid of cholesterol. We want to relish it. We want to fill our plate with as many cholesterol-rich foods as we possibly can. That's how you protect your brain. That's how you live a long time. It's integral to the stability of your organism. These fats, these are structural fats. They make up your skin, they make up your organs, they make up your bone. They're structural. They do not clog your arteries. They do not give you heart disease. You do not need to fear them. They're your best friend. They will make you lean, mean fighting machine. They will increase your cognitive powers. They will extend your longevity. They will make you happy. Okay, cholesterol is the building block for all those wonderful feel-good neurotransmitters that we're all taking, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to try to mimic. SSRIs, you know what I'm talking about? Prozacs and so forth. You don't need that. Eat fat. Lots of it. Sally Fallon, author of Nourishing Traditions, president of the Weston A. Price Foundation, she says, you want to see teeth marks in your butter. When you spread butter on your bread, you bite into it, you want to see teeth marks. She says she uses a half a stick of butter in every bowl of oatmeal. I know, you're shocked. I was too. Guess what? It works. If you have heart disease, Dr. Thomas Cowan is vice president of Weston A. Price Foundation, and he's their chief medical advisor. He says, if you have heart disease, you want to take in about 80% of your calories in the form of fat. Animal fat.
Does that mean raw, cooked, both?
We'll get there. Good question. Certainly the type of, very important, so we'll get there too. But I just want you all to understand that this is the very pivotal element in the rest of everything else that you're going to learn about on your journey. If you don't start by increasing your consumption of delicious, irresistible, finger-licking good animal fat, not only are you robbing yourself of the joy that goes along with consuming these delightful foods. Who doesn't like butter? Who? Is there anybody who doesn't like butter? Is there anybody who doesn't love a crispy chicken skin? Anybody? I don't think so. Do you really think that Mother Nature is that unkind? Is that cruel? That she would make these foods so delicious, so irresistible, and then that they would kill us? Does that make any sense at all? Of course not. Of course not. Our ancestors were not deluded. They were not brainwashed. They understood how life-giving these foods were, and they emphasized them in their diet. The Maasai of Kenya, herding people, herding tribe that Dr. Price studied when he went to Africa, they took in about 80% of their calories in the form of butter fat. Yeah, 80% of their calories. You ever seen a Maasai warrior? They're like 7 foot tall on average. The women about 6 foot tall. Lean, mean, fighting machines. Beautiful people, regal, gorgeous bone structure, wonderfully well-formed dental arches, elegant, lithe, lean. 80% of their calories in the form of butter fat. Does fat make you fat? I promise you it does not. Dr. Perlmutter promises you it does not. Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride promises you it does not. Dr. Catherine Shanahan, Sally Fallon, the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, all guarantee, will give you a notarized guarantee. Fat does not make you fat. It makes you well. It makes you happy. And it gives you long life. So eat it. Enjoy it. Lick your fingers. Number 2, the principle of organ meats and offal. We call that the guts principle, just because it makes everybody squeamish. Our ancestors prized the organs of the animals that they hunted or that they husbanded. When they would slaughter an animal, the very first thing they would do, gather up all those organs, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the brain, the adrenal glands, the sweetbreads with the thymus, harvest all of those organs and do really wonderful things with them. Have any of you ever been to France? They're magic with organs, yeah? They know how to turn organ meats into the most delightful confections on the planet. Why do they do that? Because that's where the goodies are. The organs are the repositories of all these incredible nutrients in the body. In fact, organ meat is anywhere from 10 to 100 times more nutrient dense than the muscle meat. When Dr. Price went to Canada and he studied the Native Americans there, he found that when they would slaughter their animal after a hunt, the caribou, they would do 3 things. They would harvest the organs, they would harvest the 50-pound slab of back fat, and then they would harvest the bones. The grease, the guts, and the bones. You know what they did with the muscle meat? They threw it to their dogs. The steaks, the chops, the rump roasts went to the dogs. Why? Because it's nutrient poor. What do we eat here in this country? Exclusively muscle meat. The grease, the guts, and the bones, we throw it away. We throw that to the dogs. That goes for pet food, right? And the muscle meat, oh, that's the good stuff. No. It's hard to digest, and it doesn't deliver the goods. It doesn't deliver the goodies. The organ meats, that's where it's all at, right there. So pâtés, and liver mousses, and delectably breaded sweetbreads, and steak and kidney pie, right? The list goes on and on. Sally Fallon has a whole bunch of really wonderful recipes for organ meat. The offal. The offal, the parts of the animal that don't really make any sense on a butcher's chart, right? The parts of the animal that hold all the rest of it together. Connective tissue. Really, really nutrient-dense stuff. That's where all the collagen is. Ladies, what are we getting shot into our faces these days? You don't need to do that. You need to do that. Eat sausage. What is sausage? Sausage is all the parts of the animal that, right, that would otherwise be discarded. The connective tissue. The collagen-rich connective tissue. Full of things like, all those glycosaminoglycans, you know, glucosamine, chondroitin, all those things we buy in a bottle. Sausage. Eat the sausage. Eat the pâté. Number 3 principle, the principle of bone matter. Bone matter was ubiquitous in our grandmother's diet, in our great-grandmother's diet, in our great-great-grandmother's diet. It's always a big pot on the back of the stove simmering bones, right? Nice low simmer. A French kitchen would not be complete without that ubiquitous pot on the back, bubbling away, making these unbelievable reduction sauces and gravies that the French are known for. What makes French cuisine so special?
It's rich.
Yeah. Right? And every plate comes out with this unbelievable sauce. And that sauce started in that stock pot. It's bone matter that makes those sauces so delectable.
Pâté, it may be difficult for people to find here, being from Montreal as I am. And there is a pâté made in Quebec that is available at Sprouts.
Wonderful,
And
thank you for
it's
sharing
delicious.
that.
It has cognac flavor. It has a few other flavors. It's fantastique.
Wow, très bon. So maybe you
Voila.
can email me, and I'll put that on my website.
Okay.
Sounds really great. But for those of you who are game, you can make pâté in your kitchen very, very easily. It's not difficult to do at all. Really, really simple process. Duff knows this. Very easy to do. And such great rewards, not only in terms of the culinary experience of having a beautiful little sourdough toast point and spreading your velvety, rich, delicious pâté on it, but also because, again, organ meats are a multitude more nutrient dense than any other option in the animal. Liver in particular. You asked me, I think you asked me about infant feeding. Yeah, sorry, okay. So in Africa, we talked about the Maasai. Dr. Price did in the Maasai. The very first food that a mother feeds her baby as she's weaning it is liver, raw, that she has very thoughtfully chewed, masticated, and fed to her baby birdie style. That's the only food that can even come close to replacing the nutrients from her breast milk. That's it. Liver, raw, chewed.
I'll tell Mom.
At what age would she introduce that liver?
It would be different, but I think babies were traditionally began the weaning process. In other words, the weaning process starts with the first mouthful of food. So that would be somewhere between 6 and 8 months, something like that. After that time, babies can start to get iron deficient if they don't have some, supplementary. Breast milk is not super high in
What
iron.
animals?
Well, the
Liver,
Maasai
so
were
they-
herding people, and they herded cattle, and they herded goats. So they followed the grass, they followed the rain, and so during the rainy season, the grass would feed the cattle and the goats, and then they would milk these animals, and they would turn them into cultured dairy products, which they would consume in copious amounts, enough to get 80% of their calories from butter fat. Now these cows were very different from the cows we have today. These were heirloom breeds of cows that really bear no resemblance to the cows we have in the modern industrial setting. So we have these big Holsteins and Friesians, we call them the Franking cows, the huge, monstrous black and white beasts with the udders that drag the ground. Those cows, African cows didn't look like that, nor did the Swiss cows look like that. They were very small, they were brown, they had tiny udders. They did not deliver vast quantities of milk. Okay, so maybe 5 or 6 gallons a day as opposed to 20 gallons that you can get from a hybrid industrial cow. The difference is in that magical elements, number 1, grease, the fat, the butter fat from these heirloom cows would be upwards of 6% or more. Today, some of these hybrid breeds of cows, the Holsteins and so forth, you're lucky to get 2.5%. Where are the fat-soluble vitamins? In milk. In the fat. In the cream. In the olden days before homogenization, everybody knew the quality of their milk. It was quite evident because the thicker the fat cap, the higher quality the milk. That's why homogenization was invented, right? To make it so the consumer wouldn't know good quality milk from bad quality milk. If you can't see the cream, you have no way of knowing, because the amount of cream in the milk is the determining factor in how nutrient dense that milk is going to be. If you've got this much cream, not so much. You've got this much cream, because that means that much more of those fat-soluble vitamins, which means that much more of the calcium from the milk that's going to get deposited in the bone. Yeah, that's why. Okay, so bone. It's really tough to have healthy bone without consuming bone. Dairy products help, especially raw, high butterfat dairy products, especially from cows or other ruminant animals grazing on rapidly growing green grass, like the Swiss. The Swiss, I said that they had a lot of cultured dairy. They had cultured dairy indeed, but they had cultured dairy from one very specific time of the year, and only that time of the year, okay? So the milk that they turned into butter and cheese and so forth for storage over the long, cold, dark winter in Switzerland That milk was harvested during the months of May and June. That's it. May and June. Why? Because during that season, the glaciers would melt, run off, the grass would grow very rapidly. The cell division was very accelerated during that time. The cows would come in, they would graze on that rapidly growing green grass, and the milk would be so rich in butterfat. Would be so concentrated in vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K2 during that season. Exponentially more so. In fact, they were so aware of the health-bringing properties of the butter and the cream from that season that they would take a wooden bowl and they'd fill it with the cream and they'd put a wick in it and they'd light it. And then they would go in procession to the sanctuary and lay that lit cream candle on the altar, and they would all gather around and give thanks to the Creator for another year of wellness for their babies.
Wow.
But go ahead and eat parquet. Or earth balance,
Can we have ice cream?
if you're organic. Can you have ice cream? So the Swiss were known, this particular village was known for their incredible athletes. And they're beautiful young ladies as well. Their athletes were invited to participate in athletic events all over Europe because they were the strongest, they were the fastest, they were the best. And what was their favorite pre-game food? Maybe it was a Cliff Bar? Big plate of spaghetti? Raw cultured cream. Big bowl. It's like ice cream but without the ice part. And they would load up on this cream before they would compete. Crazy. Really cool. Little stevia. Yeah. Probably had some honey or something to be put in there. Alright, so back to bone. How many of you here grew up in a household where bone broth was made weekly? Cool, really? Every week? Always. And what was done with that?
Well, my mother made a lot of soups. There were 6 of us kids back in Minnesota, and so there was always the soup pot and the bones going. I was telling Joan before class, every time she went to the butcher, she got bones.
Right. And she'd have it bubbling away?
Mhm.
So she'd make it about once a week, you said?
Oh, no, she'd make it a couple times.
A couple times a week. And was it always the same animal bones, or did she mix it up?
She mixed it out. Sometimes there would be chicken bones and with the beef bones and pork bones.
And did she use it to make gravies and
Mhm.
sauces? Very cool. So your mother was an example of what we're talking about here. You said also you grew up having bone broth?
Like she shared.
Fascinating. What about the rest of us? You too?
And my grandfather lived to be 110 without a speck of dementia. That man knew everything at all times.
So these principles might not be so foreign to you. They're resonating. Remember that. Very cool.
He ate raw bacon too.
He ate raw bacon? Fascinating. Cured.
I guess.
Somehow, salt cured.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. So what we're seeing here is that, and they were healthy.
My father lived to 101.
Your father lived to 101.
My mother was 99.
And your mother was 99.
And he had no cancer, no heart attack, no anything.
Where have you been all my life? I've been waiting for examples like you. This is really exciting. Bone matter is essential because bone matter knits us back together. You're going to live to be 101. That's a lot of repair. That's a lot of rebuilding. Why? Because entropy happens. This planet, right? This planet just creates the phenomenon known as entropy. Things fall apart eventually. It's okay. It's meant to be that way. We can repair. We can rebuild. We can regenerate. Bone matter is your secret weapon in that quest. Because it knits everything back together. It knits our digestive tract back together. How many of you here are familiar with the term leaky gut syndrome? That happens when you don't have soup. Seriously. Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride, who has the GAPS protocol, Gut and Psychology Syndrome Protocol for Reversing Autism, bases the foundation of her protocol around the soup pot. Meat stock and bone broth 3 times a day until you knit the digestive tract back together so that there's no more leaky gut. It's a phenomenally efficacious protocol. Soup. How many of you here remember that when you went to the hospital to get your tonsils out or your appendix out or whatever, while you were convalescing, what are the 2 foods that were ubiquitous on that tray? And what do they both have in common? Broth and jello. Broth and jello. Gelatin. Gelatin comes from bone matter. Gelatin is a substance made from collagen, which is a substance made from connective tissue, bone matter. You starting to see the picture here? This is why our ancestors made sausage. This is why they have the stock pot going all the time. Because when the body begins to unknit, bone matter will knit it back together. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's ancient, and it's delicious. Think about French cuisine. What do they start every meal with? Consomme. Asia, what do they start every meal with?
Fish stock.
Miso soup. Yeah, and that's why. Because of the healing effect it has on the digestive tract. Gelatin is hydrophilic. That means it attracts liquid to itself. That's what makes gelatin gel. When we eat food, cooked food, and it goes into our digestive apparatus, it has the tendency to be hydrophobic. In other words, it pushes digestive juices away from itself. This is why cooked food is very difficult to digest. You know, a lot of raw foodists will say, well, you shouldn't eat animal food because it's hard to digest. Right? You hear that a lot. You should eat plant-based diet because it's easier to digest because of all the enzymes. You cook meat, it's hard to digest. Nothing could be truer. Cooked meat is very difficult to digest. But not if first you set the stage with a bowl of soup. Why? Because then when that cooked food comes down the pike, all of a sudden, instead of being hydrophobic, it becomes being hydrophobic, yes, it becomes hydrophilic. So all those digestive juices are attracted to the digestive mass instead of repelled from it. Isn't that beautiful? This is why our grandmothers never served a roast, never served a chicken without a gravy or sauce, ever, 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 right? Am I correct?
Right.
Right, ever. Boneless, skinless chicken breast on a plate with a squeeze of lemon and a little dash of spike. That's not how they did it. That's not how they did it. It was swimming in gravy. What was that gravy made from? Bone. The roast, beautiful reduction, right? Velvety, rich, caramely, incredible reduction sauce. Starts in the stock pot, sets the stage in the digestive tract for easy, efficient, effortless digestion. Cooked animal food is very easy to digest if it's accompanied by either a sauce, a gravy, or a bowl of soup. How many people do you suppose do that at dinner time in this country? Yeah. Is it anyone? What's that?
Salad, not soup.
Yeah, salad, not soup, right? Because we know that's more heart healthy. Okay, principle number 4, and I know we have to start kind of bringing things to a close. Principle number 4 is the principle of grass. And grass is just symbolic on my little chart for the concept of the other kind of animal food as opposed to cooked animal food served with bone matter. Grass represents raw animal food. So one of the things Dr. Price found to be universal in all the different 16 countries, 14 to 16, I can't remember now, countries that he visited where the indigenous people were exhibiting these high levels of immunity, is that a certain percentage of their diet came in the form of raw animal food. Raw animal food. So today we hear a lot about raw foodism, and predominantly what's meant by that is raw plant food. So if somebody's a raw foodist, they're typically a vegetarian or a vegan, right? So they're making their green juices every morning in their blender or their juicer, and they're very much convinced that by consuming raw plant food, they're going to be extending their life and achieving this higher level of wellness and so forth. The thing is, the people Dr. Price studied that were living to be 101 plus, these people consumed their plant foods either well cooked or fermented, never raw. They're very high high cellulose plant foods. So things like dark leafy greens were cooked, usually in animal fat, right? Like in bacon drippings or fat back. Or those same foods that were high in cellulose, like all the crucifers, they were fermented, as in sauerkraut. And what both of those techniques accomplish is they do what the human digestive tract is incapable of doing. They break down the cellulose. The human digestive tract does not digest cellulose. It can't. The ruminant digestive tract can digest cellulose. Why? Because it's inhabited by colonies of bacteria. So a cow has 4 stomachs. It's rumen. And when it eats a mouthful of grass, the grass goes down into the rumen. The cow does not digest the grass either. The cow is incapable of digesting the grass. It can't break apart the cellulose and release the energy stored, sequestered in that grass. The bacteria can do that. And so that's what the bacteria do. They go to work on the grass, they break apart the cellulose, they release the sun's energy that's stored therein. And then, oddly enough, the cow regurgitates that mouthful of grass and chews it again. And allows those big masticating teeth to go to work, breaking apart the cellulose, releasing that stored information that's housed in the grass from the sun, from the celestial bodies.
Can you also, so what we are taught to believe should be a food source of fiber really is replaced by some sort of probiotic in a fermented vegetable, or a fermented food replaces the need for fiber. It serves the same function in terms of moving things
Fiber is a prebiotic for probiotics.
Okay.
Okay. Fiber feeds bacteria,
Okay.
which is great. It's the way it was designed. So the human digestive tract, as opposed to the bovine digestive tract, one stomach, no bacteria. In a healthy stomach, very little bacteria. The least populated organ of the digestive tract is the stomach. What's there instead? Acid. The human stomach is an acid chamber. What does acid digest? Cellulose? Protein. This is the #1 argument for why we are carnivorous. Because our digestive tract starts with an acid bath. Okay, and acid doesn't break down cellulose. Bacteria or heat. So when we cook our dark leafy green vegetables, the cellulose gives way to the heat. The nutrients are made available. You know, science is really clear that vegetables are very high in nutrients, a lot of phytochemicals, minerals, vitamins, so forth. That's great. That's wonderful. In a laboratory setting, not in a human digestive tract, because we can't digest cellulose. So all those wonderful elements are locked in the cellulose matrix. If we can't break it apart, we can't access those things. This is why our ancestors cooked their plant foods, or they fermented them. That's not to say they never ate any plant matter raw. The reason we consume plant matter raw, uncooked, unfermented, is when we need to purge. You seen a cat or a dog go out in the yard when they're sick and they eat what? Grass. Cellulose, yes. Why? Because they can't digest it either. It becomes a purgative. Same for us. Plant foods are very cleansing to the human body, which is essential. We need to feed ourselves, we need to cleanse ourselves. We need to bring home the groceries and take out the trash every day. Plant foods are essential for that purpose. However, they don't feed us. They do very little feeding. If we cook them, or if we ferment them, and we break apart the cellulose and we release the information stored inside, they can be more feeding. But raw, they're cleansing. So this is why the raw food movement is misguided, because what they're doing is they're cleansing themselves out of existence. This is what I did. I spent 3.5 years on a predominantly vegan macrobiotic diet, and I did this during my childbearing years while I was trying to be pregnant and breastfeed children, and I ended up weighing about 113 pounds in the hospital with a complete collapse. Because for about the first 3 weeks of my diet, of my vegan diet, I was cleansing and I felt great. And then on week 4, I needed to start feeding again. But I didn't understand that. So I just kept cleansing. And then I cleansed some more, and then I cleansed some more, and pretty soon I started to cannibalize myself. And this is what goes on. So is a vegan diet expedient? It can be. If you're 300 pounds and you're all toxic and overloaded with accumulated matter, a raw vegan diet can be beautiful for you. You can cleanse yourself. You can regain your health. You can lose all that excess weight, and you can become a lean, mean, fighting machine. But at a certain point in time, you're going to be done cleansing, and you're going to have to start feeding. And that's where the animal food category comes into play. Okay, it's that category of foods that nature has provided for us as feeding foods. Why consume animal food raw? Many reasons. Number one, because raw animal food is full of B complex vitamins that are very sensitive to heat. Very rich in these nutrients, very sensitive to heat. So the indigenous people Dr. Price studied consumed about 30 to 40% of their animal food in its raw form. Usually raw and fermented. So think
Sushi.
creme fraiche. Raw cream that's been cultured, right? Think sushi. Sushi was originally fermented food. Raw fish, wrapped in fermenting rice, allowed to ferment. Think gravlax. Swedish. Think carpaccio. These are all fermented foods. Raw, fermented animal foods. So when we eat our animal food in its raw state, it's very, very effortless to digest because all the enzyme potential is intact. And those B vitamins are also still intact. Those B vitamins are essential for feeding our adrenal glands, for feeding that, that part of us that keeps us energized. So when we talk about consuming animal food raw, what we're really talking about is sparing the enzymes that are our metabolic enzymes from having to be diverted to the chore of digestion. When we do that, all of a sudden we feel very light, we feel very fresh, we feel very alert, and we have an excess of energy as opposed to a deficit. Now, consuming our animal food cooked along with the bone matter, in other words, think about how our ancestors used to cook their meat. Did they cook it boneless and skinless? No. They put a big joint of meat, a shank, right? Or like a shoulder roast on the bone with all the connected fat. They put it in a vessel, added some liquid, put the lid on, put it in the oven, and they braised it. And that meat cooked and cooked and cooked at a very low temperature with lots of moisture in the pot, okay, on the bone, and that bone infused the meat and the sauce with all this gelatin, which then made that food much, much, much more easily digested. That's one way to do your animal food. The other way is to have it raw or rare, and preferably fermented. So the Alaskans are a great example. The Eskimos Dr. Price studied, they ate all their food raw. All their animal food raw. They didn't cook. Why didn't they cook their meat? Anybody want to venture a guess?
I just got a fire.
Huh? You would think that they would want to be warm. You would think they want lots of soups and stews to keep themselves warm. The fact of the matter is, the Eskimos didn't cook their food because they couldn't afford to. Because if they did, they'd freeze to death. Why? Because they had to stay warm. Their bodies had to stay warm. And if they diverted energy away from warming themselves to digest cooked animal food, kaput. So instead of cooking it and depleting the enzyme potential, what they did instead is they fermented it and increased the enzyme potential. So they had a saying, Dr. Price said, the Eskimos had a saying that went something like, if we feed our sled dogs raw fish, they will run 5 or 6 hours. Now that sounds like an inordinate amount of time for a dog to just run and run and run without stopping. But then they went on to say, if we feed our sled dogs fermented fish, they will run all day. Can you see how that works? Because now they were consuming this food in a way that not only allowed for complete digestion of the food itself, but then actually contributed more enzyme potential, which allowed the dogs to have unlimited energy. The same is true for human beings. You want to increase your energy, eat your animal food raw. In the Western world, that'll look a lot like raw dairy products, like raw cheese and so forth, because we don't really do, sea worms like they do in Polynesia. Every single culture Dr. Price studied ate about 1/3 or so of their animal food in its raw state so that they could have abundant energy, so that they could have high adrenal function. Adrenal function is important because what's one of the #1 things that young people today are presenting with, and even not so young people, that is really a miserable way to live?
Stress.
Stress? It's a great answer. Achoo!
Allergies.
Allergies.
So immune suppressive.
Exactly. So the adrenal glands are responsible for keeping the body from mistaking nourishing things for foreign and threatening things, right? So when we have an allergy, the body is mounting an immune response to try to deal with something that it considers a foreign invader. The adrenal glands, the health of the adrenal glands will determine whether or not the immune system gets that right or makes a mistake. Nobody should be allergic to peanuts. Nobody.
So you can fix it? You can fix it with doing what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when our adrenal function is high, because we're consuming enough of the B complex vitamins to feed the adrenal glands, we don't suffer from needless allergies, asthma and all that stuff. Okay, all those autoimmune conditions, don't have that. Because the adrenal glands are keeping the immune system balanced and in the proper order. Keeping the 2 arms of the immune system where they need to be. So when our young people were consuming dairy products raw, like the Swiss, those types of conditions didn't exist. It's one of the reasons they didn't have lactose intolerance. It's one of the reasons they didn't have gluten intolerance. The other reason had to do with the fact that they didn't try to digest their milk products. They didn't try to digest their grain products because they let the bacteria do it for them. Does that make sense? They fermented their dairy products, they fermented their grain foods, and in so doing, they actually pre-digested these very difficult to digest elements. In the case of gluten-containing foods, it's that sticky matrix, that gluten protein matrix. It's so difficult for the human digestive tract to wrestle with. It's a new food in terms of evolution. Very new food. But we can easily deal with it if we don't try to digest the gluten ourselves, but we make our bread with a sourdough starter and ferment it and allow the bacteria to do that gluten digestion for us before we consume it. This is why the Swiss children didn't have gluten intolerance, okay? Because the Swiss people didn't try to digest gluten. They let the sourdough SCOBY do that work. SCOBY, symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast. Now we just take the yeast part out of the SCOBY, we leaven the bread, but the bacterial element is missing, so the gluten never gets digested. before it reaches our stomach, and then now we have to try to do something we're completely unsuited to do. Hence, gluten intolerance. You add to that poor adrenal function, allergy. Lactose intolerance, same thing. We can't digest lactose because we weren't designed to digest lactose after weaning. The bacteria, again, they do a beautiful job of it. They completely deal with it for us so that when we consume the dairy products cultured, the lactose is dealt with and we're fine. Does that make sense? It's a really elegant, beautiful system. Same with the casein. People with casein, the protein in milk that's difficult for people to deal with, bacteria deal with it beautifully. Okay, so the grass element has to do with the fact that if we're going to consume some portion of our animal food in its raw state, it's essential that that animal food has been raised on pasture, not in a confinement animal feeding operation, not in a CAFO, not in an industrial setting. Our ancestors raised their animals out of doors, in direct contact with sunshine, fresh air, green grass, and in so doing, they protected themselves from foodborne illness. They didn't have salmonella. They didn't have listeria and all these scary bugs, right? It's not that they weren't there. They never got a foothold in a pasture-raised setting. In an industrial setting, oh yeah, they'll get a foothold. They'll take over. But outside, in the fresh air and the sunshine is the great sterilizer, right? Animals on pasture, first of all, they don't stand in their own excrement. They move about. They graze. So it's a beautiful system. If you want to eat some portion of your animal food raw, someone was asking me, okay, but what kind? Make sure it's pasture raised. Pasture. Cooked animal food too. Should all be pasture raised. But it's essential if you're going to have raw animal food. The same is true for seafood. You're going to have sushi or gravlax or something like that. The last thing you want to do is get that seafood from an industrial fish farm. Pathogens are absolutely rampant in those types of settings. So the way our ancestors were able to consume their eggs raw, their dairy raw, their meat raw, their organs raw, in the case of the Maasai feeding their infants, raw liver. They were able to do that because those cows were grazing in the sunshine, in the fresh air, on the rich, thick, nutrient-dense pasture. So there were no pathogens to be of concern to the moms that were weaning their babies onto raw liver. Okay. Number 5, the principle of proper seed preparation. We just touched on it. Someone asked about sourdough bread. All seeds on the planet contain chemicals known as anti-nutrients, which are hazardous to the health of animals and humans. All seeds, whether it's a nut, a bean, a grain, or a seed proper, like a sunflower seed or a sesame seed, all seeds are imbued with by Mother Nature with a chemical arsenal to protect them, because seeds are the babies of the plant kingdom. Mother Nature always protects her babies. So if it's a little bear cub, it's got a big mother bear to protect it. If it's a garbanzo bean, it doesn't have that advantage of having a mother bear. It doesn't have the ability to locomote. It doesn't have claws or teeth or any of the things that nature usually gives its creatures as a defense mechanism when they're young. Instead, what it has is a whole host of chemicals that, when consumed by the predator, will wreak havoc with their digestion and their mineral absorption and their endocrine system. Okay, like their ability to, for instance, take up iodine in the thyroid. It's called goitrogenic chemicals, as soybeans, which have now become ubiquitous in this culture as a food source. Unfermented soybeans absolutely devastate the thyroid because of these goitrogenic chemicals. They devastate the sex hormone balance. Why? Because these chemicals are that powerful. And so our ancestors, before they would consume these seed foods, would go to great lengths to prepare them. We've already talked about the chemicals in, say, wheat that can be problematic, but there's a whole host of other chemicals. Wheat, in addition to having a gluten matrix, also has phytic acid. And phytic acid is a chemical that chelates or bonds to minerals in our digestive tract and eliminates them. So when we eat our wheat, for instance, unfermented, without benefit of having those bacteria break those chemicals down, which is what they do, we will end up leaching minerals from our own bony structures. We'll deplete ourselves in things like calcium just by eating seed foods that are improperly prepared. Okay, so we talked about the Gaelics and the Outer Hebrides Islands and that they nourish themselves with oats. They didn't open a packet of microwavable Quaker oats, throw it in a bowl and hot water. No. That's not how they did it. Why? Because oats are the highest of all grain foods in phytic acid, this mineral leaching chemical. So what they did instead is they soaked those oats. Do you remember soaking oats? They soaked those oats in an acid medium, and then they cooked them for a very long time, and then they put them through a second fermentation stage. And then they chopped up the cod's liver and stuffed it into the cod's head. It took a long time to prepare the oats, because if they didn't take that time, they would be leaching all the wonderful minerals from the seafood right out of their body by way of this phytic acid pathway. So all seed foods require very specific means of preparation. It can be anything that mimics germination, because these seeds are held in suspended animation by these chemicals, keeps them from germinating prematurely. This is how the seed is protected. Wreaks havoc on the predators that try to consume it. It's just a way of balancing things in nature. And so therefore, animals that eat a lot of seed foods have mechanisms by which they can deal with those chemicals in their body. For instance, a squirrel has a fermentation pouch. That's one example. So human beings don't have that ability. So again, we have to do this preparation outside of our body. We have to take the time to mimic all the four elements that result in germination. That's why I call it the shoots principle. So we take a seed and we expose it to moisture, warmth, slight acidity, and time, and we end up transforming the seed from something that's very hazardous to consume to something that is nourishing to consume. If we don't do that, we end up at a net loss. And that's where we are today. Yes, ma'am?
Should you buy sprouted seeds?
Ideally. Or you can sprout them yourself. And if you're going to do something like make bread, you're going to need to put that seed through further steps. So our ancestors, before the advent of industrial agriculture and the combine harvester and the hermetically sealed grain silos, they kept the grain, harvested it quickly, kept it dry. All grain foods were harvested by hand. And in so doing, they were exposed to moisture. It was inevitable. As hard as they tried not to let it get wet and rot, it was inevitably going to be exposed to moisture. When that happens, that pre-germination begins. That breaking down of those chemicals, that releasing of the chemical hold on the seed begins. Then, after that, they would put it through this process of sourdough fermentation that would allow for further breakdown of the chemicals like phytic acid, further pre-digestion of the gluten, and so forth. So by the time they ate it, it was a radically different food than it had been in the field, still on the stalk. And then after they did all this, they would bake it, and Dr. Price said in the Swiss village in particular, where rye bread was the staple along with dairy products of the diet, they would take that bread and they would put it in kind of like a disc shape, and at the top there would be a little hole, and it would come out of the oven, and they took it and hung it from hooks on the rafters of their little chalet and allowed it to continue to ferment. And in so doing, it would develop more flavor, it would become even easier to digest, and it would have really wonderful shelf life because the acid would inhibit mold. So it's just a beautiful way to preserve their food source throughout the cold, dark winter. And to make that food that is inherently indigestible by human beings digestible. Something that would be a net loss in terms of nutrients becomes a gain. So that's the principle of shoots. The same applies to nuts, our Native American ancestors would soak their nuts in a brine, and then they would dry them on the rocks in the sun, and they would break down the chemical anti-nutrients that way. And they're really delicious when you do that. So Sally Fallon has lots of recipes for things, what she calls crispy nuts, and tells you how to do the same kind of preparation with beans. Various beans require different types of preparation. But what it all comes down to is mimicking germination. Consciously taking the steps to allow those chemicals to go through an alchemy. And then we come to our final principle. Every single indigenous culture that was displaying these high levels of immunity that Dr. Price studied used the technique of lactofermentation and culturing to preserve their harvest. And in so doing, what they were unintentionally achieving was a very high level of immunity by constantly replenishing their digestive tract with what? Bacteria, with probiotics, the stuff we go and spend $40 a bottle for, so unnecessarily. Okay, all you need is a $2 cabbage, some salt, and a jar, and you will have the most radical probiotics and prebiotics that you could ever dream of. Never spend another nickel on a probiotic supplement. I mean, you can if you're very ill and you need to go that extra step. But for those of us that are enjoying moderately good health, just to maintain that level of immunity, ferment your food. Ferment your food. Ferment your plant food. Ferment your animal food. There's recipes and nourishing traditions for all sorts of wonderful plant and animal-based foods that are fermented and cultured. Make sure that you're getting real cultures when you buy things like yogurt. You know, in order to really make yogurt, it takes at least 24 hours of culturing. None of the yogurts on the market are fermented for 24 hours. You gotta make it yourself. You gotta do it at home. I'm not gonna say none, but none of the commercially available yogurts that you could go to Vons and buy, none of those are gonna be properly fermented. None of the sour creams, none of these types of cultured dairy products that you're gonna find at your conventional grocery store are gonna be properly fermented to allow for the types of bacterial inoculation that we're trying to achieve. Okay, and the lactose is not going to be properly dealt with, and the casein is not going to be properly dealt with because it takes time. It takes live cultures and it takes time to get that level of fermentation that's actually going to, you know, give you an asset in terms of your immunity. Remember, science has discovered that anywhere between 70 and 80% of our immunity resides in our gut. So our ancestors, by preserving their food through lactofermentation and consuming it every single day, were constantly feeding their immune system. They were replenishing those bacteria. Okay? It's wonderful and it's delicious and it's fun. You can do it with children. You can do it with anyone. Get a group of friends together. Decide to have a fermentation party. I heard there actually are clubs all over the country, all over the world, where people gather together like they would for a potluck, but instead everybody brings a cabbage or whatever they're going to ferment, and they do it together. It's very bonding. It builds community, and at the same time, what we're doing is we're kind of giving the fungu to the man, because this is something we can control. This is something we have complete agency over. Nobody can take this away from you. Okay? You need some kind of a food source, you need a vessel, and you need salt. Like the Swiss used to bring in backpacks up to their village so they could make their kraut. That's all you need. There are excellent books on fermentation. Sandor Katz is our country's leading fermentation expert. He wrote a book called Wild Fermentation. He wrote another book called The Art of Fermentation. He was recently interviewed by Terry Gross on Fresh Air on PBS Radio, or on on NPR, and he did an amazing job of explaining the magic of fermentation. So don't be afraid. Just dive in. Just go buy yourself, you know, a head of cabbage or a bunch of carrots or some beets, or if you're really adventuresome, get yourself some beautiful wild-caught salmon and make some gravlax. All these recipes again are in nourishing traditions. And I can't encourage you strongly enough to eat your fat and ferment your food.
So where do you get the organs?
So, all right, so we talked I said I would talk a little bit about sourcing. So, see, the thing is that sourcing is something that is dynamic because vendors are constantly coming and going. And so to say, oh, we'll go to this vendor and buy your chicken livers, really wouldn't be very, it's not a long-term solution because today's vendor might not be there tomorrow, especially small farmers, because this is a very, very difficult way to make a living. And so they do their very best. Sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. So instead of me telling you what all the vendors are here in this county, what I'll do instead is I'll tell you what to look for. When you're sourcing animal food, the number one thing you're looking for is that those animals were raised on pasture. It's more important than organic or any of that stuff, okay? The most important thing is that it's pasture raised. If you're looking for eggs, you're looking for pasture raised eggs. If you're looking for dairy products, you're looking for pasture raised dairy products. You're looking for animals that are enjoying Mother Nature's provision for them. Remember, cows, in particular, are only designed to eat one thing. Yeah, yeah. That's all they can digest. They were designed as monofeeders. They're obligate grass eaters. They have to eat grass. If they don't eat grass or the little seeds during the season when the grass goes to seed, if they don't eat grass and its seed, then they will become acidic in their digestive tract and will get ill. And we don't want to be eating sick animals or sick animal products. Okay? We want to be eating healthy animals and healthy animal products. The only way cows can be healthy is if they're raised on pasture, a grass-based system. Now pigs are different. Pigs are foragers. They're omnivores, very much like we are. They will eat anything that they can find, including each other or us, if they have the opportunity. So pigs need a little bit different environment, but it's still basically an out-of-door pasture system. Now, pigs are going, because of the way their skin is very light like ours, they're going to be seeking out shade. So typically pigs are best off in the woodland areas, surrounding the pasture. So in a natural setting, you're going to have all the grass for the cows, and you're going to have all the woodland around the outside, and that's where the pigs are. Chickens are not vegetarian. I don't care how many times you see an egg box that says vegetarian fed hens. Chickens, again, are omnivorous. And in fact, they're predominantly carnivorous. Anybody who's ever raised chickens knows that they look for anything that moves.
Including mice.
Including mice, including other chickens. Or anything they can catch and kill and eat. They prefer animal food. And when they have abundant supply of animal food, they are very nutrient dense. Their egg yolks are dark, dark, dark orange like a pumpkin. That comes from eating insects because insects are extremely high in fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A. Okay? So when the chickens eat those insects, their egg yolks become very high in vitamin A. It's a very protective nutrient. So what we're looking for is we're looking for sacred foods. Dr. Price dubbed the special foods that were used to facilitate healthy reproduction in the indigenous cultures. Those categories of foods he called sacred foods. So with the Eskimos, it was the fish eggs. Okay. With the Gaelics, it was the cod liver. With the Swiss, it was the spring butter, the May and June butter, right? The Maasai, it was the liver from their cattle. And these sacred foods fall into a few categories. These are the foods that are the highest in the fat-soluble vitamins. So you're going to find those foods fall into the categories of organ meats, cream and butter, the fat of the milk from animals grazing on rapidly growing green grass. So that's going to be the springtime and the fall in the northern hemisphere. Eggs, all kinds, from animals that are foraging in a pasture. The reason eggs or chickens need to be pasture raised isn't because they're eating the grass so much or the other plant matter in the pasture, but because that's where the bugs hide. Okay, a chicken in a dirt yard isn't going to have much to eat, even if you feed it corn, right? Because what it really wants is it wants those worms and those grubs, and it's going to find those hiding in the grass in the pasture. So organ meats, dairy products from cows grazing on rapidly growing green grass, eggs, seafood, and in particular shellfish. Dr. Price found that the healthiest people on the planet, in his opinion, were the ones that had access to copious amounts of seafood, and in particular the shellfish, and in particular the crustacean butter in the shellfish, that really gelatinous, gooey stuff. That's where the fat-soluble vitamins are found. So each culture that he studied had their own special food that represented the maximum concentration of these nutrients. And guess what? Every single one of them was an animal food. Even in Africa, where it appeared that a lot of the tribes were vegetarian, in fact, they were consuming a great abundance of insects. Insects are extremely high in the fat-soluble vitamins, especially K2. In fact, termites are higher in vitamin K2 than any other source. This is why you see gorillas with a stick in a termite hole. They're going for their K2. So if we don't want to eat insects, then we can eat animal food that ate insects, right? Like poultry eggs and so forth. And the fat on the chicken, the skin. We don't want to throw that away. We want to eat the legs, the thighs, the drumsticks, because that's where the fat is. Always seek out the fat first. I promise you, if you do nothing else, you will be grateful at the end of your days that you sought out the fat. Because if you're not fueling your body with fat, what are you fueling it with? There's only one other choice. Sugar. Sugar. The human body is fueled by fat or sugar. If you're not fueling it with fat, you are fueling it with sugar. And the tax we pay to fuel our body with sugar is enormous. The destruction that it does to our organs and our systems. This is metabolic syndrome. Okay? Metabolic syndrome happens when we fuel ourselves with sugar instead of with fat. When you fuel yourself with fat, you get things like conjugated linoleic acid. You heard about that? It's a magical substance that creates lean muscle mass, and it's found in the fat of ruminant animals, the dairy products. Okay, it's found in the cream and the butter from animals grazing on grass. You get CLA, not only do you get a beautiful restructured physique, but you also get this very protective mechanism from cancer and heart disease. Fuel yourself with fat. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yes, ma'am.
One quick one. But I have a friend that when they cook chicken, they also actually eat the bones, and they've been doing that for a long time.
And you can, because chicken bones, when you cook a chicken low and slow for a long time, maybe in a crock pot or braise it, the bones will literally start to disintegrate. And so you can. And my grandmother always ate chicken bones. Always, 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 always.
I've never seen eggs where it says our chickens are eating insects.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be just so refreshing?
And what do you think about vegetable juice? You're getting the good stuff out of it, but you're not having to digest the fiber, so it should be really good, right?
It's very cleansing. So vegetable juice is one of those things you would want to employ in a healing protocol where accumulation was the problem. If you have a situation where depletion is the problem, okay, then you don't want to be doing a lot of juicing because it's cleansing and it's chelating and it's cooling to the body. So if you're overweight and sluggish and you have brain fog and you have a rash and you're constipated, your tissues are, saturated with toxicity, that's the time you want to employ a technique like juicing. And you want to do it judiciously, and you want to do it only as long as you need to. And the minute you stop craving your carrot, beet, celery juice, or your, dark leafy green juice, the minute you stop craving that and you start craving a juicy hamburger patty, don't let this get in the way. This organ up here is highly unsuited to tell you what to eat. In fact, it's the worst possible mechanism. Why? Because this is where the will resides. And the stronger your will, the more damage you will do to yourself. Because The mechanism that is designed to tell you what to eat is twofold. And it goes like this. On the front end, it's craving, desire, okay? And on the other side of the spectrum, it's satiety and pleasure. Craving, pleasure. If you're talking about foods from these categories that our ancestors would have recognized, that great-great-grandma would have thought, oh yeah, that's food. If you're talking about those categories of food, don't use this. Use this only as long as it takes to source these foods. You know, let your brain take you to the farmer's market and ask the farmer if his eggs are pasture raised. And then shut it off. When you get all that good food home in your larder, in your pantry, don't pay any more attention to your brain. Don't listen to what you read on the internet. Don't pay attention to the glossy magazines that tell you the latest diet fad. Listen to your craving. If all you crave is ice cream every single day for 3 days running, eat it. Make sure it's made from cream that's raw from animals that were raised on pasture. Sweeten it with raw honey. Okay, use some pasture-raised eggs in there. Make your own beautiful nutrient-dense ice cream, a la the Swiss athletes, and then eat it to your heart's content. And when you don't crave it anymore, eat something else. That's as simple as that. It's so simple. Would nature make it any other way? Okay, how could our ancestors have made it 2.5 million years without the internet to tell them what to eat? What did our ancestors rely on? They relied on seasonal availability and craving. And that's how they did it. And they stayed in balance. And soon, their cravings and the seasonal availability lined up. For time, they lined up. And the same will work for you. Go to the farmer's market, look at everything, take it in with your senses, not your intellect. Look at it. What's beautiful? What smells good? What tastes good when I sample it? Buy that. Take it home. And over time, you will start to crave those things that are local, in season, sustainable, organic, pasture-raised. And that's all you will crave. And you will become a lean, mean, ancestral fighting machine. Thank you all so much for being here. Oh, I'm sorry. I never self-promote. I always forget. Okay, so if you want to learn more about what it is that I do in my 6-week Ancestral Cuisine series, go to lardmouth.com. Really simple. I didn't bring cards tonight, but it's easy to remember, lardmouth.com. And hopefully you'll be able to find everything you're looking for there. There's a blog, there's class information, there's some resources there, and you can always drop me an email and ask me anything you want.